the staff car rolled to a stop on the muddy road outside Koblenz. It was August 24, 1944, and inside the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht headquarters, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and dread. An aide rushed through the corridor clutching a decoded telegram, its contents already known to every officer in the building through whispered conversations and pale faces. Romania had surrendered. King Michael had arrested Marshal Antonescu, declared an armistice with the Soviet Union, and within hours, Romanian troops were turning their guns on their former German allies. But it was not the loss of an ally that caused the silence in that room. There were 4 words buried in the intelligence summary: Ploiești is now lost. For the German war machine, this was not merely a strategic setback. It was a death sentence pronounced on every Panzer, every Luftwaffe squadron, every mechanized unit that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, stood at the map table and traced his finger across Romania. He did not need to explain what every officer already understood. Germany's most sophisticated tanks, the Tigers, the Panthers, the King Tigers just entering production, were about to become the world's most expensive stationary pillboxes. Without Ploiești, without Romanian oil, the Panzers would stop. Not from enemy fire. Not from mechanical failure. But from something far more mundane and far more devastating: empty fuel tanks. This is the story of how Germany's war died not on a battlefield, but in the oil fields of Romania. It is the story of how the most technologically advanced military force of its time was rendered immobile by a resource it never adequately secured. And it is the story of what German commanders said, and what they could not say, when they realized that their panzers, those symbols of blitzkrieg invincibility, would soon be nothing more than steel tombs scattered across Europe. To understand the catastrophe that unfolded in August 1944, one must first understand Germany's oil crisis, a crisis that existed not from that summer, but from the very first day of the war. Germany entered World War II as a modern industrial power with a fatal weakness: it had almost no domestic oil production. In 1939, Germany produced approximately 5 million barrels of oil annually. The United States, by comparison, produced over 1.3 billion barrels that same year. Britain controlled oil fields in Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait. The Soviet Union had Baku. Germany had coal, iron, and industrial capacity, but its lifeblood, petroleum, had to come from elsewhere. The answer, German planners believed, lay in synthetic fuel production and strategic partnerships. Germany had developed the Fischer-Tropsch process to create synthetic petroleum from coal, and by 1940, synthetic fuel plants were producing roughly 4 million tons of fuel annually. But this was never enough. A single Panzer division on offensive operations could consume up to 100,000 liters of fuel per day. The Luftwaffe's fuel demands were even greater. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, later calculated that by 1944, Germany needed at least 7.5 million tons of fuel annually just to maintain existing military operations. Synthetic production could provide less than half of that. The difference had to come from conquest and alliance. In 1940, after the fall of France, Germany secured access to French fuel stocks. But the real prize lay to the southeast, Romania. And specifically, the oil fields surrounding the town of Ploiești, about 35 miles north of Bucharest. Ploiești was not the largest oil-producing region in the world, but for Germany, it became the most important. In 1943, Romania produced approximately 5 million tons of crude oil, and the vast majority of it, roughly 60% of Germany's total imported oil, flowed north into the Reich. The oil fields of Ploiești had been developed in the late 19th century and had grown into one of Europe's major petroleum centers. By the start of World War II, Ploiești contained 11 major refineries, including the massive Astra Romana, Concordia Vega, and Columbia Aquila facilities. These refineries did more than just pump crude oil, they processed it into aviation gasoline, diesel fuel, and lubricants specifically suited for military applications. German engineers worked alongside Romanian technicians to optimize production for Wehrmacht needs. The facilities operated around the clock, and trains loaded with fuel barrels rolled north toward Germany in an endless convoy. German military planners understood their dependency. In internal Wehrmacht memoranda from 1941, staff officers repeatedly warned about the strategic vulnerability of relying so heavily on a single source located hundreds of miles from German borders. But there was no alternative. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941, was predicated on capturing Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, particularly the fields around Baku, which produced 75% of Soviet oil. If Germany could take Baku and hold Ploiești, the fuel crisis would be solved. If Germany lost both, the war was lost. The Wehrmacht never reached Baku. By late 1942, German forces had pushed deep into the Caucasus, reaching the outskirts of Grozny and even planting the Nazi flag on Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in the range. But Baku remained out of reach, and by February 1943, after the disaster at Stalingrad, German forces were in full retreat. The dream of Soviet oil died in the rubble of the Sixth Army. That left Ploiești as Germany's only lifeline. The Allies understood this perfectly. American and British intelligence had identified Ploiești as Germany's Achilles heel as early as 1942. Destroy Ploiești, and you cripple the Wehrmacht's ability to maneuver. Ground the Luftwaffe. Strand the Panzer divisions. The challenge was that Ploiești was far from Allied air bases, too far for fighters to escort bombers all the way there and back. Early raids in 1942 had been ineffective. The refineries were heavily defended with anti-aircraft batteries, and the distance meant bombers arrived with minimal fuel reserves for evasive maneuvers. But in 1943, the Americans decided to try something audacious. On August 1, 1943, 177 B-24 Liberator bombers launched from bases in Libya for a low-altitude daylight raid against Ploiești's refineries. The mission, codenamed Operation Tidal Wave, was one of the most ambitious and costly bombing operations of the war. The B-24s flew in at treetop level to avoid radar detection, roaring over the Romanian countryside at less than 500 feet. The Germans and Romanians were waiting. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Barrage balloons forced the bombers to climb into the teeth of the defenses. Fighters swarmed them. 54 bombers, nearly one-third of the attacking force, were shot down. Another 53 were so badly damaged they barely made it back to base. 532 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. And the damage to Ploiești? It was significant but temporary. Several refineries were hit hard, and production dropped by roughly 40% for a few weeks. But by October 1943, production had returned to near normal levels. German and Romanian engineers had repaired the damage with remarkable speed. The Allies had paid a terrible price and achieved little lasting impact. For Germany, the tidal wave was a victory. The oil kept flowing. The Panzers kept moving. Albert Speer visited Ploiești in late 1943 and reported to Hitler that production was stable and could be sustained indefinitely as long as Romania remained in the German camp. But that qualifier, as long as Romania remained in the German camp, was the knife that would eventually cut Germany's throat. Romania's alliance with Germany was never ideological in the way that, say, the relationship between Germany and Italy attempted to be. Romania had joined the Axis in November 1940 to protect itself from Soviet expansion and to reclaim territory lost to the Soviet Union in June 1940, when Stalin had forced Romania to cede Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. The Romanian dictator, Marshal Ion Antonescu, committed Romanian forces to Operation Barbarossa alongside the Wehrmacht, and Romanian troops fought brutally on the Eastern Front, particularly during the siege of Odessa and the battles in Crimea. But by 1944, Romania was exhausted. Romanian casualties on the Eastern Front exceeded 300,000 dead and wounded. The Red Army was now pushing west through Ukraine, driving toward the Romanian border. In April 1944, Soviet forces reached the Dniester River, the natural boundary of Bessarabia, and the implications were clear: Romania would soon be a battlefield. And if the Soviets broke through, Ploiești itself would come under direct threat. King Michael of Romania, a young man who had been sidelined by Antonescu's dictatorship, began quiet negotiations with opposition politicians and military officers. The question was no longer whether Romania should leave the Axis, but when and how. The Romanian people had no appetite for dying to defend Berlin. The economy was shattered. Allied bombing raids, resumed with greater intensity in the spring of 1944 as American air forces established bases in Italy, were systematically destroying the refineries. Between April and August 1944, American B-17 and B-24 bombers flew over 20 major raids against Ploiești, dropping more than 13,000 tons of bombs on the oil facilities. Unlike tidal wave, these raids were high-altitude strategic bombing missions flown with fighter escorts. The Germans and Romanians shot down dozens of bombers, but they could not stop the attacks. By early August 1944, production at Ploiești had fallen to less than 30% of capacity. Refineries were cratered ruins. Storage tanks burned for days after each raid. The oil was still there underground, but the infrastructure to refine and transport it was being methodically destroyed. And then, on August 20, 1944, the Red Army launched the Jaci-Chișinău offensive, smashing through Romanian and German defensive lines in northeastern Romania with overwhelming force. Within 3 days, Soviet tanks had advanced over 60 miles, encircling and destroying the German Sixth Army, reformed after Stalingrad, for a second time. Romania's military situation collapsed. On the evening of August 23, King Michael summoned Marshal Antonescu to the royal palace and informed him that Romania was withdrawing from the Axis. When Antonescu refused, the king had him arrested. Hours later, Romania announced an armistice with the Soviet Union and declared war on Germany. The news reached German headquarters in stages, each report more devastating than the last. First came word that Antonescu had been overthrown. Then confirmation that Romania had switched sides. Then the unthinkable, Romanian troops were disarming German units stationed in Romania and turning their weapons over to the advancing Soviets. Within 48 hours, the Red Army had secured Ploiești without firing a shot at the oil fields themselves. The refineries, what remained of them after months of Allied bombing, were now in Soviet hands. At the Wolfschanz, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the mood was apocalyptic. Hitler flew into one of his legendary rages, screaming about betrayal and ordering immediate counterattacks to retake Romania. But his generals knew the truth: there were no forces available for such an operation. Every available division was committed to holding back the Soviets in Poland and the Allies in France. Army Group South Ukraine, which had been defending Romania, had just been destroyed in the Jaci-Chișinău offensive. There was nothing left to send. The real discussions happened in quieter rooms, among officers who understood logistics and industrial capacity. General Heinz Guderian, recently appointed Chief of the General Staff, reviewed the fuel consumption reports and the updated supply forecasts. The numbers were unforgiving. With Ploiești gone and synthetic fuel production under constant Allied bombing, Germany could expect to receive perhaps 3 million tons of fuel for the remainder of 1944. The Wehrmacht needed at least 6 million tons to maintain defensive operations on 3 fronts. There was no mathematical solution. Units would have to be immobilized. Operations cancelled. Panzer divisions were relegated to static defense because there would not be enough fuel to maneuver them. At a staff conference on August 26, just 3 days after Romania's defection, Guderian presented the fuel situation to senior commanders. His language, as recorded in Wehrmacht war diaries, was clinical but damning. The loss of Romanian oil production represents a reduction of approximately 60% in available petroleum imports. Synthetic fuel production is under severe pressure from enemy strategic bombing. Current reserves are insufficient to sustain mobile operations beyond October. All mechanized formations must reduce operational tempo immediately. Fuel allocation will be prioritized for defensive positions and counterattacks of strategic importance only. Translated from staff officer German into plain language, Guderian was saying, the Panzers are about to stop moving. Choose carefully which battles you want to fight, because you will only get to fight a few more. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, the Armed Forces High Command, was more blunt in his private assessment. In a letter to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, Keitel wrote, "The situation regarding fuel is catastrophic. We must consider all operations in light of extreme scarcity. There is no solution on the horizon." The phrase "no solution on the horizon" was as close as the German High Command came to admitting defeat while the war still raged. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from Albert Speer. In his memoirs written after the war, Speer recalled the moment he learned that Romania had switched sides. He was at a meeting in Hitler's conference room when an aide brought the news. Hitler began ranting about treachery, but Speer tuned him out. He was doing mental arithmetic, calculating how long Germany's war machine could function without Ploiești. His conclusion, which he shared with several colleagues but never dared speak to Hitler directly, was simple: the war is now lost. It is only a matter of time. The impact was not theoretical. It was immediate and visible on every front. In late August and early September 1944, German panzer divisions in France were retreating toward the German border, harried by Allied forces. But they were not retreating in good order with fighting withdrawals and counterattacks. They were fleeing because they had no fuel to maneuver. Tanks were abandoned by the roadside, not because they were damaged, but because they had run out of fuel and there was no fuel to retrieve them. The Allies captured dozens of Panthers and Tigers that had been simply left behind, their crews dismounting and continuing the retreat on foot. In the Falaise pocket in Normandy, where the German 7th Army had been encircled by Allied forces, the Germans abandoned over 300 tanks and assault guns in mid-August. Many were out of fuel. The crews spiked the guns, fired a round with the barrel obstructed to destroy it, and walked east. Maintenance crews who might have recovered these vehicles had no fuel trucks to bring them back to German lines. The most advanced armored fighting vehicles in the world became scrap metal in French fields. On the Eastern Front, the situation was even more dire. The Soviet summer offensive of 1944, Operation Bagration, had destroyed Army Group Center and pushed German forces back hundreds of miles. German commanders desperately needed their panzer divisions to counterattack, to blunt the Soviet advance, to create a stable defensive line. But the fuel was not there. Panzer divisions that should have been racing to threaten sectors were instead crawling forward at infantry speed, preserving what little fuel they had. Some divisions reported they could conduct operations for only 2 or 3 days before their tanks would be immobilized. General Hermann Bulge, one of Germany's most capable panzer commanders, was given command of Army Group G in France in September 1944 with orders to stabilize the front. He later wrote with bitter clarity about what he found: "I had panzer divisions in name only. The tanks existed. The crews were trained. But they could not move. Fuel allocations were so restricted that even short tactical movements had to be approved by higher command. We were supposed to conduct mobile defense with immobile forces. It was absurd." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The loss of Ploiești forced German commanders to make impossible choices. Every liter of fuel had to be rationed, prioritized, allocated according to strategic necessity. But who decides what is strategically necessary when the entire front is collapsing? The German High Command established a priority system. Fuel would be allocated first to units directly defending the Reich's borders, then to units conducting critical counterattacks, and finally, if any remained, to units in general defensive positions. In practice, this meant that many divisions received almost nothing. The Luftwaffe was hit even harder. German fighter production had actually increased in 1944 despite Allied bombing. Factories were turning out Bf-109 fighters and Fw-190 fighters at record rates. By autumn 1944, Germany had produced over 3,000 new fighters in a single month. But they could not fly. Pilot training programs were cut back because there was no fuel for training flights. Experienced pilots were given strict flight time limits. New pilots reached combat units with minimal flying hours, making them easy prey for experienced Allied pilots. The Luftwaffe's fuel allocation for September 1944 was less than half of what it had been in September 1943. By November, it had been cut by another 40%. The jet-powered Me-262, which began entering service in late 1944, required special synthetic fuel for its engines. Production of this specialized fuel was prioritized, but even the jets faced shortages. Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, later estimated that Germany lost more Me-262 to fuel shortages and training accidents caused by inadequate training time than to Allied fighters. The most advanced fighter aircraft in the world was grounded because it had nothing to put in its tanks. Training suffered catastrophically. Before Ploiești fell, German Panzer crews received extensive training that included actual driving time in tanks, gunnery practice with live ammunition, and tactical exercises in the field. After Romania's defection, training programs were slashed. New Panzer crews arriving at the front in late 1944 had sometimes driven a tank for only a few hours total. They had fired the main gun perhaps 3 or 4 times. Against experienced Soviet or American tank crews who had been in combat for months or years, these inexperienced German crews had no chance. The loss of fuel did not just strand existing tanks, it destroyed the Wehrmacht's ability to train the crews needed to operate them effectively. Logistics became a nightmare within a nightmare. The German military had always struggled with logistics, the Wehrmacht supply system was infamously chaotic, but fuel shortages made everything worse. Trucks that should have been moving ammunition, food, and replacement parts to the front could not move because there was no fuel for them. The German army increasingly relied on horse-drawn transport, a technology from the previous century pressed into service because the trucks were immobilized. By late 1944, the German army had over 1 million horses in service, more than it had at the start of the war. But horses move slowly, carry less, and require fodder that also had to be transported. The vaunted modern Wehrmacht was regressing into a pre-industrial force. The Eastern Front demonstrated the consequences most starkly. When the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, smashing westward from Poland toward Berlin, German commanders had panzer divisions in reserve that could theoretically stop the breakthrough. The tanks were operational. The crews were ready. But the fuel tanks were nearly empty. Orders were issued for counterattacks, but the panzers could not reach the designated assembly areas. Some divisions moved less than 20 miles before running out of fuel and having to halt. The Soviets simply drove around them. Soviet commanders noticed immediately. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front driving toward Berlin, reported that German armored counterattacks, which had been a constant threat earlier in the war, had become rare and ineffective. When they did occur, the panzers advanced a few miles, fired off their ammunition, and then often had to be abandoned because there was no fuel to withdraw them. Soviet intelligence officers interrogating captured German tank crews consistently heard the same story: "We had orders to counterattack, but we only had enough fuel to go forward. There was nothing allocated for withdrawal." Yet even in this desperate situation, the German High Command planned one last offensive, one final attempt to prove that the panzers could still strike. This was the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, launched on December 16, 1944. Hitler personally insisted on this operation, overruling his general's objections. The plan was audacious. German forces would punch through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, drive to the Meuse River, and then swing north to capture the port of Antwerp. Cutting off Allied supply lines through Antwerp would, Hitler believed, force the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all forces against the Soviet Union. The operation required fuel on a scale Germany could no longer provide. The attacking forces included some of Germany's best remaining units, the 6th Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army, totaling over 400,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns. Moving these forces into position, then sustaining them during the offensive, would consume millions of liters of fuel. Germany did not have millions of liters to spare. But Hitler ordered that fuel be scraped together from everywhere. Reserves were drained. Synthetic fuel plants were pushed to maximum production. Fuel was even taken from defensive units on other fronts, leaving them literally immobile. The Luftwaffe contributed what it could spare. In total, German planners assembled approximately 5 million gallons of fuel for the Ardennes offensive, enough, they calculated, to reach the Meuse River if everything went according to plan. The crucial phrase was if everything went according to plan. German planning for the Ardennes assumed that attacking units would capture American fuel depots intact and use American fuel to continue the advance. The operational orders explicitly stated that forward Panzer units were to prioritize capturing enemy fuel supplies. In other words, the German offensive was predicated on stealing the enemy's gasoline. This was not conventional military planning. This was desperation elevated to strategy. The 6th Panzer Army's commander, SS Oberstgruppenführer Joseph Sepp Dietrich, understood the insanity of this plan. When shown the fuel allocation for his army, he reportedly told Hitler's staff, "You give me enough fuel to reach the Meuse if the roads are clear, if we meet no resistance, if we do not have to maneuver, and if the weather is perfect. None of those conditions will exist. This entire operation depends on capturing American fuel. What happens if we do not?" The staff officers had no answer because there was no answer. If the Germans failed to capture American fuel depots, the offensive would simply run out of gas. The attack began before dawn on December 16 with massive artillery bombardment. German panzers crashed through American lines, creating panic and confusion. For a few days, it appeared the impossible might happen. German columns penetrated up to 50 miles into American-held territory. Towns fell. American units retreated in disarray. But the fuel situation was already deteriorating. American resistance was stronger than expected, forcing the panzers to detour and consume extra fuel. The weather, which was supposed to ground Allied aircraft and allow the Germans to move freely, did prevent air attacks initially, but it also turned roads into muddy quagmires that increased fuel consumption. And critically, the Germans failed to capture the American fuel depots. American engineers destroyed them or evacuated the fuel before German forces arrived. Kampfgruppe, an SS Panzer battle group that achieved the deepest penetration, reached the town of Stillmont, about 25 miles behind American lines, before grinding to a halt. They had fought their way through determined American resistance, but they had used nearly all their fuel. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper sent radio messages back to headquarters: "We have no fuel. We cannot advance. We cannot retreat. Send fuel immediately." No fuel came. American forces surrounded Paper's battle group. After several days of fighting, Paper ordered his men to abandon their tanks and equipment and escape on foot through the forest. They left behind dozens of Panthers and Tigers, many completely undamaged, sitting by the roadside with empty fuel tanks. American soldiers walked through the abandoned German column in amazement at the advanced machinery simply left behind. By late December, the entire Ardennes offensive was running on fumes, literally. Panzer divisions reported fuel states in single-digit percentages. Some units were towing tanks with other tanks to conserve fuel. Others were conducting combat operations within a 1 or 2 mile radius because they could not move further. By early January 1945, with American counterattacks gaining momentum, German commanders requested permission to withdraw their forces before they were encircled. But withdrawal required fuel. Some panzer divisions had to destroy their own tanks before retreating because there was no fuel to drive them back to German lines. The Battle of the Bulge consumed Germany's last significant fuel reserves and achieved nothing. The Allies retook all lost ground by late January. Germany had expended fuel it desperately needed for defensive operations elsewhere, particularly on the Eastern Front, where the Soviet offensive was about to smash through into Germany itself. Hitler had gambled everything on a single throw of the dice, and he had lost. After the Bulge, there were no more major German offensives. There could not be. The fuel was simply gone. In February 1945, German Panzer divisions on the Eastern Front reported average fuel availability of less than 10%. Some units had completely dry tanks. Crews sat in their immobilized Tigers and Panthers as Soviet forces advanced, firing their guns as long as the ammunition lasted, then destroying the tanks and retreating on foot. In Hungary, where Germany launched a desperate offensive near Lake Balaton in March 1945 to protect the last accessible oil fields in Europe, Panzer divisions attacked with minimal fuel reserves, advanced a few miles, and then were counterattacked by overwhelming Soviet forces. They could not maneuver to respond. They simply died where they stood. General Heinz Guderian, watching the German military disintegrate, wrote in his final reports as Chief of the General Staff, "Fuel shortages have rendered impossible the conduct of mobile operations. Our most modern equipment sits immobile while the enemy maneuvers freely. We have the technology to resist but not the fuel to employ it. The situation is hopeless." This from the man who had pioneered blitzkrieg tactics, who had commanded panzer armies across Europe, who understood armored warfare better than almost anyone alive. Even he could not overcome the simple mathematics of empty fuel tanks. Albert Speer delivered the final verdict. In a memorandum to Hitler dated March 15, 1945, Speer wrote with unusual directness, "The war is lost. Fuel production has collapsed to levels insufficient to sustain even minimal defensive operations. Synthetic fuel plants have been destroyed by bombing. Natural sources are in enemy hands. There is no prospect of recovery. Continued resistance only increases the suffering of our people." Hitler ignored the memorandum and ordered continued resistance to the death. But Speer's assessment was inarguable. Without Ploiești, without synthetic fuel, without any prospects of securing new oil sources, Germany's military had become a static force waiting to be overrun. The final collapse came quickly. In April 1945, Soviet forces encircled Berlin. German panzer divisions that might have counterattacked to break the encirclement had no fuel to move. Some had been literally towed into defensive positions by other vehicles, then left there without sufficient fuel to relocate if the tactical situation changed. When Hitler committed suicide on April 30 and Grand Admiral Karl Donitz assumed leadership of what remained of Germany, one of Donitz's first acts was to review the fuel situation. The report he received stated that available fuel stocks would last approximately 4 days at current consumption rates. 4 days. For an entire nation's military. When Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, Allied forces occupied German territory and found thousands of panzers, assault guns, and armored vehicles. Many were undamaged, simply abandoned because they had no fuel. American and British officers walked through German tank depots and found brand new Panthers fresh from the factory, never driven beyond the factory grounds because there was no fuel to deliver them to combat units. The Tiger II, Germany's most powerful tank, was produced in the hundreds, but many never saw combat because there was no fuel to move them from production facilities to the front lines. Post-war interrogations of German commanders produced remarkably consistent testimony. When asked why Germany lost the war, they cited many factors: Allied material superiority, strategic bombing, fighting a multi-front war. But when asked what single factor most crippled their ability to resist in the final year, the answer was almost always the same: fuel. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, when interrogated by American intelligence officers, stated, "After Romania fell, we knew we could not win. We had the finest tanks in the world and no fuel to move them. We trained crews but had no fuel for training. We planned operations but had no fuel to execute them. Every strategic decision after August 1944 was made under the shadow of fuel shortage. It paralyzed everything." Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely considered one of Germany's most brilliant tactical minds, was even more succinct in his post-war memoirs: "The loss of Romanian oil was the beginning of the end. Everything else was simply playing out of that inevitable consequence." The numbers bear out their testimony. In January 1944, before the intensified bombing of Ploiești began, Germany had access to approximately 700,000 tons of fuel per month. By September 1944, after Romania's defection, that figure had fallen to less than 200,000 tons per month. By March 1945, it was under 70,000 tons per month. The Wehrmacht needed at least 500,000 tons per month to maintain defensive operations. The mathematics of defeat were simple and absolute. The story of Ploiești and Germany's fuel crisis reveals a fundamental truth about modern industrial warfare: technology means nothing without resources. Germany engineered the Tiger tank, a 60-ton behemoth with an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding a mile. Germany produced it in the hundreds. But a Tiger without fuel was just a very expensive pillbox. The Luftwaffe developed the Me-262 jet fighter, faster than anything the Allies flew, capable of outrunning and outfighting enemy aircraft. But without fuel, it sat on the ground while Allied bombers destroyed German cities. The irony is sharp and instructive. Germany spent enormous resources, intellectual capital, industrial capacity, engineering genius, developing superior military technology. The Panther was arguably the best medium tank of World War II. The Tiger II was the most heavily armored and most powerful tank fielded by any nation. German engineers created weapons systems that were years ahead of their time. But all of that technological sophistication could not overcome a simple shortage of petroleum. In the end, German panzers stopped not because they were defeated in battle, but because they ran out of gas. When staff officers gathered in that room in Koblenz in August 1944 and learned that Ploiești was lost, they understood immediately what was coming. Not defeat in some abstract future sense, but the specific, concrete, inevitable paralysis of the German military. Their panzers would become stationary targets. Their aircraft would be grounded. Their logistics would collapse. And there was nothing they could do to prevent it. No brilliant tactical maneuver could conjure fuel from thin air. No strategic genius could substitute for petroleum. They knew, in that moment, that the war was over. It would take 9 more months of fighting, 9 more months of dying, but the outcome was already determined. Germany's most advanced military in history would be defeated not by superior enemy technology, but by empty fuel tanks and the hard logistics of industrial warfare. The lesson echoes across history: wars are won not just by those with the best weapons, but by those who can fuel them, move them, supply them, and sustain them. Germany learned this lesson in the most devastating way possible, by watching its unmatched panzers become monuments to the limits of technology without resources. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.